Okay, everybody, now I want to talk about this Hollywood Reporter movie news about the upcoming Simon Kinberg trilogy and what it means for the character of Rey Skywalker after the Rise of Skywalker from 2019. So, earlier this month, it was revealed that Simon Kinberg was developing a new trilogy of Star Wars movies for Lucasfilm that was going to somewhat feature Rey. You know what? I'm going to believe it when I see it. There's been so much over the last couple of years that Star Wars and Lucasfilm have put out there that just haven't really amounted to much. Names that come to mind are Taika Waititi, Sean Levi, James Mangold, Kevin Feige, Patty Jenkins, Benioff Weiss, Rian Johnson, even Donald Glover, who was going to get a Lando TV show before it became a movie. And now maybe that movie's not even going to happen. So obviously, they are trying their best to get their shit together, for lack of a better word, and that just doesn't seem to be happening. The reason I find this article rather interesting is because it addresses the specific points that I've been feeling, and I know a lot of y'all have been feeling as well, when it comes to the continuation of Star Wars. Not necessarily on the TV front with Disney+, but on a cinematic one. And that is the fact that Rey Skywalker, Daisy Ridley's character, might be the biggest cinematic asset that the Star Wars franchise has up to this point. Whether or not that's a fair comparison is literally yet to be seen. Daisy Ridley is obviously a decent actor in her own right. I feel like a lot of people, that's up to debate for a lot of fans, but I feel like it's hard to say that she is a bad actress. If you have any issue with Rey Skywalker in any way, shape, or form, I feel like you can bring that up, especially with J.J. Abrams or Rian Johnson, anybody else at Lucasfilm, not necessarily the actress who was portraying that role. That being said, there's so many avenues that Star Wars can go, given the fact that it's a complete galaxy of stories and interesting concepts that can be explored. And Disney has kind of failed to do any of that. If there's anything Disney has done to expand this universe or galaxy at all, it's been in the aftermath of the prequels or during the prequels or immediately after the original trilogy. They haven't so much touched all the stuff that they could do like within the sequel trilogy or immediately after the sequel trilogy. That is, despite the Rey movie that they announced in 2023, where she was going to be building up a new Jedi Order, and they were going to start building away from the episode arcs, getting away from all the major lore that was built around the first 9 films and focusing on their own stories. Anyway, after the news broke that Kinberg was going to be tapped to create a new trilogy, that's when rumors started abounding that these next 3 films were going to be part of the Skywalker saga and be utilizing Daisy Ridley's Rey as a bit of a Obi-Wan Kenobi role within those films. And for those people like myself who've been following these rumors and stuff for the last couple of years, that's when it started to feel just a little bit off. Because back in 2023, not that long ago, it was being announced that, hey, we're going to be doing a Rey Skywalker movie that was going to be set after the trilogy movies and focusing on her building her own Jedi Order. Wasn't going to be an episode, not episode 10, not any continuation of the Skywalker franchise. It was just going to be its own standalone film building off of one of the biggest cinematic assets that they have in their roster, based on characters who are actually still alive. I feel like this is something that's really important to talk about and something that the article itself talks about pretty in depth. That when it comes to cinematic assets for the Star Wars franchise, Rey is one of the biggest remaining ones that's still alive and is easily accessible that can be built around for any future sequels. Obviously, Mark Hamill's still alive, but you cannot just simply do another Luke Skywalker movie, especially after The Last Jedi. Obviously, you can't really focus on Leia, you can't really focus on Han because Harrison Ford just literally doesn't care about Star Wars at all. You cannot focus on Lando, at least, kind of in the future. You can do Donald Glover, but you can't necessarily focus on him in the future. And honestly, you can't really focus on Vader anymore. You can certainly focus on him as much as you want, but to lesser and lesser degrees. You can't really get as badass as you were with Rogue One, and his character's been long dead in the continuity. It depends on what you do. And quite frankly, as much as people really want it, you can't just keep going back to the well and doing de-agifying like other actors to look more like Mark Hamill and other people just to try to do another episode in between 6 and 7. I feel like that's a little too overkill, and we just certainly aren't there yet with technology. Additionally, I don't think Disney has done enough to really prove that they can do anything with Disney Plus characters on the big screen. I know we have The Mandalorian and Grogu coming out in May of 2026, but if anything, even though I really liked it, the Marvels really proved that you can't just simply create characters and storylines and everything connected to a broader universe and introduce them into the broader universe on a cinematic front and have people care. It's too much homework. People do not watch content like this. We learned this lesson back in the early 2000s with The Matrix doing online stuff, video games, comic books, the Animatrix, and all this other stuff that literally just didn't really amount to much success on a cinematic front. And we definitely saw that with the lukewarm reaction to The Matrix Reloaded as well as The Matrix Revolutions. People don't gravitate towards cinematic universes like that, and it feels like Marvel is learning that in slow motion. And it feels like, and I'm going to talk about this sometime in the future, hopefully, but certainly feels like DC and James Gunn is going to be learning that pretty aggressively here in the next couple of months, especially even regardless whether or not Superman is a huge success or not. So yeah, one of the things this article certainly talks about when it comes to the future of Star Wars in this Simon Kinberg trilogy is whether or not the Rey movie or the Kinberg trilogy get made first. Essentially, who gets across the finish line at any real given point. If Simon Kinberg writes a fantastic treatment for episode 10, they might go in that direction. If the Rey movie that's been kind of on the back burner for as long as it has figures out a way of moving forward with that character that's a little bit different than what Kinberg is doing, but they're liking it more, then that's going to come out on top first. That being said, I don't necessarily know if any of that's going to happen because at least with the delays that we've seen with the Rey movie, it makes me think that the Rey movie is pretty much indefinitely on hold. They don't want to do that anymore. And they're looking to continue the Skywalker story outside of a direct continuation of episode 9 and jumping even further into the future and restarting again, trying to recapture the magic with characters that they still have, like Rey. And I quite frankly, I don't like that as a consumer. I feel like you got to take, for better or worse, what you have and try your best to kind of remold it and reshape it into something that the general audiences likes. Doing a new trilogy to me with new characters, kind of playing off of the older characters that we were just introduced to about a decade ago, is going to feel so much more like this, okay, we were here, we're introducing characters, we're introducing new concepts, and it's just another reiteration of A New Hope in the same way that The Force Awakens was. Not necessarily taking any real lessons from the original sequel trilogy that you kind of butchered, thinking that you're going to spend some social capital or generational nostalgia that you've already used up within those last 3 films that you made. So with all that being said, let's get into some of the tidbits. When it comes to Rey, one of the insiders quotes in the article, "She is the most valuable cinematic asset in some ways, maybe even the only Star Wars has right now." And that kind of goes into what I was saying about the continuation of the Star Wars franchise and what I've been saying about the continuation of the series within Disney Plus. Obviously, you have Pedro Pascal's The Mandalorian, and you have Grogu, both coming on Disney television screens, like on Disney Plus, but you have them going to be the anchors of their own movie. I don't think, even though those are the most popular assets with Star Wars right now, at least largely, theoretically the most popular with how successful the first and second season of Mandalorian were, I just don't really see that translating to a hugely successful movie. I could be wrong, but I'm looking at it in terms of like, this is going to be a solo situation. As long as they can keep the budget under control, then people will go gravitate towards it, but it's probably not going to be more than like $400-550 million worth of a success. And, it might be just a big box office bust if it becomes way out of control and they have to reshoot and redo all this other stuff. Who knows there? Anyway, the article goes on to say that Rey is probably the most intricate and useful character that the entire Star Wars franchise has at this point. Something that they can utilize on a cinematic front and push forward with pretty much the best opportunity for box office success. Personally, I don't know if I agree with that. They have Rey, they have Finn, they have Poe, they have other characters that were introduced within the sequel trilogy that can be utilized in much more interesting ways than they were handled with those first 3 films. Again, I don't necessarily think throwing away everything, jumping further into the future, and reintroducing those characters as mentors to new characters before our characters had a chance to really define themselves and have enough of a push to have their own stories be told. That's kind of my biggest issue here is Rey still has a bunch of story that can be told. Poe has a bunch of story that can be told. Finn has a bunch of story that can be told. There is avenues, there's issues, there's situations where these characters can become much more than what they were introduced as, and they can actually drive their own stories forward before we just utilize them as kind of centerpieces for a new story, a new generation, and a new kind of like restart to the entire franchise. Kind of solidifying the idea that, yeah, Disney and Lucasfilm really messed up with the sequels and they have no way to reshape them or recontextualize them to the broader audience. Kind of like how George Lucas did with the prequels. Obviously, nobody really liked the prequels all that much when they first came out, but they did television shows, video games, all this other stuff in between that storyline to really build it up. So even though the films themselves were a little bit lackluster, if you look at them in the broader context as a fan, man, nostalgia bait. Man, fantastic stories down the line. Even though those movies aren't great, you have some kind of appreciation for everything that was being told. Nothing exists for that with the sequels. Nothing, at least at this point. They are literally, especially with this news with Simon Kinberg's trilogy moving forward too much into the future, they are abandoning those stories altogether. They are admitting defeat and they're realizing that they have nothing to say with these characters, these situations, these stories, or anything going forward. They screwed the pooch, and this is, even though I don't want to say it, even though I'm not this red pill community and the people who really harp on Star Wars and Lucasfilm and all this other stuff for going woke, going broke, and whatever it might be, these people must have messed up if they're already thinking to push forward in the storyline so far that Rey, Finn, Poe, and any other people who were in their prime during the sequel trilogy are no longer useful unless they're used as kind of the anchors for new characters that you introduce in the future. That's embarrassing. And it's something that I don't necessarily want to see. If you have stories to tell, if you have something to do that moves past the sequel trilogy, then use these characters in their prime and use them where they're actual focal point of the story that can push it in the future to an interesting degree. Don't just sidestep them completely. Anyway, this article does go on to kind of deify the Star Wars mythology, and I guess this kind of makes sense. The idea that Star Wars in relation to fandoms, in relation to fiction and everything is kind of a religion unto itself. Obviously, you have DC and Marvel and Star Wars and Harry Potter and all these other things. But in relation to all of them, all of these are very successful franchises. Star Wars has always been movies first. Harry Potter is a book. Marvel and DC are comic books. There's decades and decades and decades of canon and various stories and things to adapt. Nothing is really kind of set in stone with those properties in the same way that Star Wars is. One of the insiders literally says that you're being asked to create a New Testament because the old movies, the first trilogy is the Old Testament in terms of cinematic landscape films. And no one can agree whether or not this is the best idea going forward. Like, whether or not you should do this or be second guessed to do this. What's the best thing to do when it comes to nostalgia? And quite frankly, I just think that that's kind of pussy shit. I think tell the best story you can. Don't necessarily worry about what the fans are going to think and what's the best thing that you can do for the overall business. Obviously, Disney's going to care about that. But if, as some of these insiders are saying with this article, that Star Wars is nostalgia-based entertainment and they're running out of ways to create nostalgia, then I think you've already lost. You had your opportunity in 2015 through 2019 with the new sequel trilogy. You've had your way when it comes to like figuring out television shows, video games, comic books, all these other things, and you've done nothing with them. You've already lost. You need to pack up. You need to figure out a way around this. And the idea, as I've said over and over and over again in this video, you do not just completely pack up and do something outside of the sequel trilogy. You have these characters, you have these situations, you can build something on here. You just need to have the balls to do it. Quite frankly, it seems like Disney doesn't have the balls to do any of this. They're trying their best to play it safe and figure out the best way forward that's going to cost them the least amount of money. But quite frankly, I think if they do this Simon Kinberg trilogy, depending on his track record as such, there's a great possibility, if not the likelihood, that people do not gravitate towards this. Because Rey, at least for right now, Rey is not Luke Skywalker, not Princess Leia, not Han Solo, not Chewie, not any of these other people. And the people who did grow up with the sequel trilogies that might end up becoming a little bit more sympathetic of Rey's character, Finn, Poe, or any of these other people, they're not as old as the boomers who were literally alive when the first Star Wars movie came out, who were excited for the sequels, who were excited for the prequels, or the millennials or Gen Xers who were excited for the prequels and sequels, or even the Gen Z who was excited for the sequels. Like, people are jaded now more than ever. Disney has pissed away its capital when it comes to Star Wars with everything on Disney Plus. There's not as much excitement, and I don't care about that. They need to do something. They need to recreate the characters and everything that they've put forward with this franchise in order to save it. They just can't simply keep kicking the can down the road and restarting. But those are just my thoughts.